All right, we're back again. This is still week 2, and this is your second lecture for the week. Today we're taking on learning, cognition, and memory. Okay, this is all from chapter 2 in your book. Hopefully you've already turned in the reading guide for chapter 2, or you've definitely at least read chapter 2 before you watch the lecture. It makes a little more sense usually if you read before you watch the lectures. Just something to know as we move on. All right, so today we're going to talk learning theories. We're going to talk behaviorism, social learning, constructivism, and information processing. So these are all different learning theories. That means they're things that people have sort of tested out and they think are pretty true. And we are going to kind of talk about how they work and how they impact what we talk about in our education classes these days. So the first theory we're going to tackle is behaviorism, in which learning is viewed as a process of acquiring and modifying associations among stimuli and responses. Basically, that means that people learn by doing a behavior and then seeing what the consequences are. Are the consequences good? If so, we're probably more likely to continue doing that behavior. If the consequences are bad, we are more likely to not continue doing that behavior because, nobody wants to get hurt. And so some people that you probably maybe heard of in the past are Pavlov, who did classical conditioning, and B.F. Skinner, who did operant conditioning. So if you remember Pavlov, he was the guy who trained his dogs to salivate basically every time they heard a bell ring. So every time he made a bell ring, he would give the dogs food. And so for a long time, he did this over and over. And then after a while, the dogs could hear the bell ringing, and whether the food was present or not, they would begin to salivate because they considered that the dog, that the food would be forthcoming because they had begun to associate the sound of that bell ringing with the food being brought to them. So, the sound of the bell is a stimulus, and then the response was the salivating because they thought the food would come, right? And operant conditioning is pretty similar to that. You can read more about that in B.F. Skinner in the book. So behaviorists believe that people are born a blank slate. We have nothing, we know nothing, we are just pure unadulterated goo coming into the world with nothing in our little brains. However, as we go about doing certain behaviors and certain consequences happen to us or certain stimulus comes to us, we will change our behavior accordingly. So, if a baby continuously tries to grab something that's hot and they continuously get punished for doing that, theoretically they'll stop doing it, right? So that's one way behaviorists believe. They think that learning to do better will result in change of your behavior and that we reinforce your behavior through a stimulus. So let's say you studied for your spelling test and you did very well, so you were given a reward. Well then, perhaps we're reinforcing the behavior of studying because you will want more reward. That's the sort of thing you can expect from a behaviorist perspective. Okay, so I told you already a little bit about classical conditioning, about what Pavlov did. There's a, somewhat wonderful little chart there that will explain it to you. In B.F. Skinner's case, he went with something that he called operant conditioning. He said that a response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus is likely to occur again. So when behaviors do not produce any results, they decrease or they disappear altogether. Right? So his thing was mice. He had some mice. He had a little contraption that he put them in that would shock them. And so they could push a certain button and basically either get food or get shocked. And so, depending on which button they pushed. And so eventually the animals kind of learned, not to push the button that would get them shocked, but they also learned you could push the button that would give you food. It's a whole thing. Your book goes into it in much more detail than I will. Right, so this is how we use behaviorism in the classroom typically, right? This is how you may see it. And think back to some of your teachers who probably also did this. You have to specify a desired behavior at the start. So, usually when we get a new class of kids, we teach them all the things that they're supposed to do in class, like raise their hands when they want to ask a question, get a hall pass when they need to use the restroom, things of that nature. And so then you have to make any contingencies explicit, like, for example, if I don't want students going to the bathroom while I'm in the middle of a lecture or instructions, then I have to let students know that. If there's any exceptions to the behavior that I'm expecting, I have to tell them. Otherwise, they don't know, and, they'll just do things and get consequences, and they'll be confused and frustrated. So you do have to identify consequences that are truly reinforcing for each student. For example, let's take a parenting example, right? So I am a somewhat introverted person who enjoys my alone time, and I very much love books. I will spend hours off by myself reading a book. So when I did a thing that my parents wanted me to continue doing, it would have actually been very good for them to send me to my room. Because I liked that. I liked that alone time. I could go to my room and I could read my book, right? They could be like, you finished all the chores today. Why don't you go off to your room and read your book? That would have been very reinforcing for me. Whereas for students who are a bit more, let's say, extroverted, being sent to your room all by yourself is a punishment, not a reinforcement. For students who don't like to read books, being told to go to my room and read a book might have, not reinforced the behavior they wanted from me, right? So you have to make sure that all students have an opportunity to earn whatever the good consequence or the good reinforcement is. And then sometimes there's a group contingency. If all the group is doing this awesome thing, we will reinforce it by giving them some cool consequence that they like. And then you have to be really consistent about it because, as if you give candy to one student for doing something cool and then another student does the same thing and you don't give them candy, you're going to hear, oh, it's not fair, you blah, 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 right? So you have to be consistent and you have to encourage people and then monitor the progress. I'm sure you can think of some examples of how this might have been used in your classrooms back in the day when you were students, other than the examples that I just gave you. Okay, so the next thing is social learning theory. We believe in social learning theory that people learn from observing or working with one another. So this was brought up by a guy named Albert Bandura, and if you want to, you can click on the link and learn more about him in the slides in Brightspace. Originally, he called it the observational theory, and then it became social learning or social cognitive learning theory. It basically means that we learn vicariously. We watch other people, and we learn through seeing what they do, and then observing and then also modeling those behaviors ourselves. So copying people, basically. We see them do a thing, and then we copy it. Right? So that's pretty self-explanatory, I think. See a thing, do it yourself, basically, is social learning theory. Okay, so one of the things that's really important in social learning theory is modeling, basically where you show the behavior you want the students to do, right? So, the good thing about that is it promotes, kids to pay attention. They retain the information better. Also motor reproduction. So, we learn to do things by moving sometimes. So that often comes into play in modeling. And then it can also give them a lot of motivation because they see other people doing it and they think, oh, okay, I can follow that. I can do that too. Okay, the next theory we've got is constructivism. Constructivism says that we learn when we create knowledge from our observations and experiences. So in the last two theories, people were more or less just absorbing information that hadn't been given to them. Like, information is dumped out over your head in a bucket, and you just get soaked with the information and absorb it, right? Whereas with constructivist theory, we believe that people actually create knowledge themselves. It's not just dumped into you. So Piaget was one of the main theorists of this. He came up with the theory of cognitive development. He thought there were 4 stages of developmental stages of learning: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. We will actually talk more about those things in a later chapter, so you don't have to remember all that just now. Vygotsky was another one of those constructivist guys. He had a theory that social interaction precedes development. So, like, you literally can't develop in your learning without social interaction. And consciousness and cognition are the end product of socialization and social behavior. So he totally thought you had to have social interactions before you could learn. And he also brought up the concept of scaffolding, which is where you help students get up to a certain level in their learning by giving them basically little steps to go up. So you challenge them, but you don't challenge them so far that they can't reach the next step. And then once they reach that step, you challenge them to reach the next step, and so on and so forth. He also came up with this idea, the zone of proximal development, which is the distance between a student's ability to perform a task under the guidance of a more experienced mentor or teacher, or with some help from another student, and their ability to solve the problem independently. So he thought you wanted to give students just enough of a challenge that you would still have them in that zone of proximal development. So you're giving them a challenge, but you're not giving them a challenge that's so far they can't reach it. And you're definitely doing it with guidance and mentoring to help them get to the next steps. Okay, so in chapter 5, we'll talk more about these guys. That's just a brief introduction. Right, so here is a good visualization of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. We start in the center with what the learner can do by themselves. And we want them to grow, right? To come out of that middle circle into the bigger circles. So we can ask students to come out a little bit from that zone with guidance and assistance, right? And that's the zone of proximal development. That's what they can reach if we help them. But what we don't want to do is challenge them so far that they are out here, trying to get out here, right? Into the zone of what they cannot do yet, right? So baby steps, basically, but also a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so some things to think about. You can pause and think about them if you like. How much of other people's conversations do you hear when you're technically not listening? I've been a teacher for 15 years. I hear lots of things when I'm technically not supposed to be listening. Sometimes things that my students would probably wish I did not hear. And sometimes, totally fine things, no big deal. What specific things attracted your attention to conversations other than yours? For me, it's often that I hear a hint of drama, a little bit of tea being spilled, maybe a little chisme, a little bochinche. Forgive me, I do speak Spanish, so that's going to come out sometimes. Usually it's something juicy. If I hear something juicy, I'm like, ooh, okay, what are they talking about? I don't know if you're like me, but that is totally what I would say to that question. And then were there times when you were not attending to the person speaking to you because of something another person was talking about? Ladies and gentlemen, I have ADHD. Number 3 is my entire life. It doesn't matter how hard I am trying to pay attention to someone. If there are other people around talking, I've probably wandered off to a totally different conversation in my mind. It's not on purpose. It's just the way my brain works. So the answer to that question is that happens on the daily for me. So take a little time and think about that for yourself. Some important points related to that. It is really difficult to pay attention to more than one message at a time. I'm sure you know, 2 people talking at you at once, very hard to pay attention to either one, right? You don't generally pay attention to whoever is speaking to you if that person's message is less interesting than another message being presented at the same time. For example, my husband is an attorney, If he comes in the house one day and I am watching a TV show and he starts rattling off to me about some very complicated legal thing that he did that day, I'm probably paying more attention to my TV show than I am to him, because it's just more interesting, right? So, tip for those of you who have similar relationship situations: pause the TV, pay attention to your partner. It is what it is, right? So what's true for you with your attention will also be true for your students. So this is why, it's so hard for students to pay attention to what you're saying if, I don't know, the funniest kid in the class is telling a good joke in the back of the class, right? I consider myself to be fairly humorous, but there are definitely a lot of students who are funnier than me who could absolutely steal the attention of the class, right? So that's the sort of thing we're talking about here. All right, so the next theory is information processing theory. In this case, we're focusing on what actually goes on inside the learners as they learn, cognitive processes in the brain, those particularly involving learning, memory, and performance, right? So declarative, procedural, and conditional knowledge building. These are all covered in your text, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on those. So it also has to do with types of memory, for example, sensory memory, sound, sights, smells, all those things can trigger memory. Short-term, or what we like to call working memory. Basically, some of the input goes into your brain and it's easily recallable for you to process a little bit later in your short term. People like me who have ADHD and executive dysfunction issues often have issues with working memory. Just so you know, this will probably get covered in one of your classes on special education and how to help students in inclusive learning environments later on. And then there's long-term memory, and that is where your knowledge gets stored relatively permanently. Like, it's just in there forever and forever. So in this theory, when we talk about learning, we're talking about moving ideas from your sensory memory, which is usually the first kind of memory you have, into that space of long-term memory, so that you never forget it. Right? So going from sensory memory to your short-term memory to your long-term memory. Okay, so when it comes to information processing theory, they made up this acronym that is supposed to help you make your lessons more effective in getting kids to move from that sensory memory all the way to long-term memory. Okay, so it's MOVER: meaningful learning, organization, visual imagery, elaboration, and rehearsal. Actually, we're going to go back for a second and talk about each of those. So if the learning is meaningful, kids will learn it better. If the learning is organized, kids will learn it better. If it's not all over the place, right, they'll categorize it in their brains more strongly. Using visual imagery is a major thing. So, never just try to explain something by talking. Having some sort of visual will always help people learn better. Elaboration. Don't just say the thing you want the students to learn and move on. You need to talk about it a little bit, give examples of it, model it, maybe talk about how it works in the real world. And then rehearsal. Rehearsal is trying the new thing or concept that you just learned to see if you can do it yourself as a student. So practice, basically. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about learning preferences now, and the types of learners that you can expect to find in a classroom. So learning preferences are just preferred approaches or ways of learning. They're just the ways kids or, students in a college classroom like to learn. Right? So there are some types of learning preferences. We have the MI theory, which is multiple intelligences. We will get into that much later, for real, because we do have a module on that coming up later on in the class. And then there are the most common ones: visual, auditory, and tactile or kinesthetic. So visual is what you see, auditory is what you hear. Tactile and kinesthetic are touch or movement, so physical learning. Now, just because you feel like one of those things is better for you than the other does not mean you can't learn in those other ways. One of the things I was always telling my Spanish students when it came turns to learn, let's say vocabulary, for example, I consider myself a visual learner. So the flashcard thing really works for me. You know, the word in Spanish on one side, the word in English on the other, and I just look at them. I just go through them. However, that's not the only way I can learn that vocabulary. I can also learn it by saying it out loud. Say what it is in Spanish, say what it is in English. My brain will take in that auditory input and make a connection between those two words. I can also watch videos. Videos are great for this sort of thing because they definitely hit both the visual and the auditory learning. And then tactile kinesthetic. One of the ways you could bring that into your Spanish class is by giving people objects to touch or to play with that are vocabulary words, right? So if we're learning food, I might hand them an apple and be like, okay, manzana, la manzana, right? And so they have the apple in their hands and they're hearing me say the word and they can kind of take in that learning, right? Games and movement and songs, all of these sort of fall under those different visual, auditory, and tactile learning styles. Okay, so I did sort of go through this already. Visual learners prefer to learn through seeing. Some of them do better in picture form as opposed to just looking at text. I'm actually kind of the opposite of that, and there are some students who will be, who actually learn better through using words. But generally speaking, it's better to use pictures. Auditory learners prefer to listen. They do really well with discussions. A lot of them do very well with lectures, too. And then the kinesthetic or tactile learners like to move. They like to do things. They like to touch things. They like hands-on stuff. Every engineering student you've ever met has probably tried to learn by taking apart things and putting them back together again, just to see how they work. So that would be a kinesthetic or tactile learning type of preference. Okay, so that is a real quick summary of the different kinds of learning preferences and learning theories that we're going to talk about in this class. So for the next class, you've got the UDL module, which is very important. So you'll just go through the module, you'll do your thing. I will probably make a little tutorial video about how to do the UDL module also. But that is it for this lecture for this week. So for week 2, you should have watched 2 lectures, the lecture on chapter 1 and this lecture on chapter 2, and you should have done both the chapter 1 and chapter 2 reading guides and turned them in by Sunday at 11:59. All right, so that's what we've got for this week. I hope you're having a great week, and I will be back to talk to you some more via the internet next week.